Picture this. It's 50,000 years ago. The sun has just dropped below the horizon somewhere in what we now call southern France. The temperature is falling fast like it does every night during the Ice Age. But you're not cold. Not yet. Because 20 feet away there's a fire crackling, throwing dancing shadows across the limestone cliff face behind you. The smell hits you first. Roasting meat. Fat dripping onto hot stones with a sizzle that makes your mouth water. Someone's turning a hair on a spit made from a green branch. The skin is starting to char, split open, revealing the flesh underneath. Next to the fire, there's a flat rock covered with wild roots, still dirt-covered, heating slowly. And in the coals themselves, wrapped in wet leaves, something else is cooking. Maybe freshwater mussels from the river, maybe birds' eggs, maybe wild onions that someone found that morning. You're hungry. You've been hungry for 3 days because the hunting hasn't been good. But tonight, there's food. And tomorrow, if you're lucky, there will be more. This was dinner, not sometimes, not on special occasions. This was how humans ate for hundreds of thousands of years, around fires, with whatever they could find, hunt, trap, or dig up. And here's the thing that should blow your mind. That meal, that simple combination of meat and plants and fire, shaped every cell in your body, the way your gut works, the size of your brain, how your teeth are arranged in your jaw, even how long you live. We are quite literally built from Stone Age dinners. But what did our ancestors actually eat? Not the Instagram version with grass-fed steaks and organic kale. Not the modern paleo diet with its protein shakes and coconut oil. The real thing, the stuff that kept humans alive when survival was never guaranteed, when winter could kill you, when a broken leg meant death, when going hungry for a week was just called Tuesday. That's what this is about. The truth behind the Stone Age diet. And I'm warning you now, it's way stranger and more complicated and more fascinating than anything you've heard before. If you're listening to this to fall asleep, that's perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe and do me a favour. Leave a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is. Because I check these comments and it's wild. It'll be someone in Sydney at sunrise, someone in Chicago at midnight, someone in Berlin making breakfast, all listening to the same story about humans who died 50,000 years ago. There's something beautiful about that. Now, when most people think about the Stone Age diet, they picture cavemen tearing into mammoth steaks. All meat, all the time, the ultimate carnivore diet. But that's not even close to the full picture. Our ancestors ate insects. They ate bone marrow scraped from inside cracked bones. They ate wild seeds that would take hours to gather and process. They ate shellfish and bird eggs and tree bark and probably some things we'd find absolutely disgusting today. They ate what they could get. And what they could get changed depending on where they lived, what season it was, and frankly, how lucky they got that week. Here's what makes this story even more incredible. We're going to trace this journey across hundreds of thousands of years, from our earliest ancestors scavenging scraps in Africa to Neanderthals hunting woolly rhinos in Ice Age Europe, from tropical coasts where people lived on seafood to frozen tundras where plants basically didn't exist for half the year. And everywhere we look, we're going to find the same thing. Humans adapting, humans surviving, humans eating whatever it took to make it to tomorrow. But this isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity, because here's the uncomfortable truth. Your body, right now in the 21st century, is still designed for that Stone Age diet. Your digestive system expects certain foods. Your metabolism runs best on certain fuel. Your gut bacteria evolved to process things that most of us never eat anymore. We changed our diet faster than our bodies could evolve to handle it, and we're living with the consequences every single day. So we're going to start at the very beginning. Millions of years ago, before we were even really human yet, Back when our ancestors were still figuring out that there was more to eat than just fruit and leaves. Back when someone first picked up a rock and realized you could use it to smash open bones and get at the fatty marrow inside. That moment changed everything. It set us on a path that would eventually lead to agriculture, to civilization, to you listening to this right now. But first we need to understand where we came from. We need to go back, way back. Let's get something straight right from the start. When we talk about the Stone Age diet, we're not talking about some trendy meal plan you can follow for 30 days. We're talking about roughly 3.5 million years of human history. 3.5 million years. That's not a diet. That's an entire evolutionary epoch where everything about how humans ate was constantly changing, adapting, transforming. To put that in perspective, modern humans, Homo sapiens, have only existed for about 300,000 years. The Stone Age began long before we even showed up. It started with creatures that barely looked human, creatures that would seem more like upright apes if you saw them walking toward you across the savannah. The Stone Age gets divided into periods because archaeologists love organizing things. You've got the Paleolithic, which means Old Stone Age. That's the big one. That covers from about 3.4 million years ago up until around 12,000 years ago. Then there's the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, running from about 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, depending on where you are. And finally the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, when people started figuring out agriculture and everything went sideways. But we'll get to that disaster later. What matters for now is understanding that each of these periods had completely different food landscapes, different climates, different animals, different plants, different humans. Because here's what nobody tells you. There wasn't just one human species eating its way through the Stone Age. There were multiple species of humans, sometimes existing at the same time, sometimes competing for the same resources, each one eating differently because they lived in different places and had different bodies and different brains. Let's start with Homo habilis, handyman, the toolmaker. These guys showed up around 2.4 million years ago in East Africa. Small bodies, still partially adapted for climbing trees, but with brains noticeably larger than earlier apes. They weren't impressive by modern standards. Put a Homo habilis next to a modern human, and you'd be looking at something maybe 4 feet tall, probably weighing less than 100 pounds, with arms that seemed too long, and a face that jutted forward in ways that would look wrong to us. But they were eating meat. Not much, probably. Mostly scavenged from kills made by actual predators. But they figured out tools, simple stone flakes that could cut through hide and strip meat from bones. That was the breakthrough. That was the moment the human lineage stepped onto a path that would lead to everything else. Then came Homo erectus, upright man. Now we're talking about a game changer. These humans showed up around 1.9 million years ago, and they were different. Taller, sometimes over 6 feet. Bodies built for long-distance walking. Brains significantly larger than Homo habilis. And most importantly, they figured out fire. Homo erectus spread out of Africa. They colonized huge chunks of Asia and Europe. We find their tools and fossils from Spain to Indonesia, from Ethiopia to China. They survived for nearly 2 million years, which makes them the most successful human species in history if you're measuring by longevity. And everywhere they went, they adapted their diet to whatever was available. In Africa, they were probably eating a mix of scavenged meat, hunted small game, roots, tubers, fruits. In Asia, they encountered completely different food sources, different animals, different plants, different challenges. Some populations lived near water and added fish and shellfish to their diet. Others lived in grasslands and focused on hunting herd animals. Still others survived in forests where plant foods would have been more reliable than meat. Then the climate started doing what climate does. It changed, constantly, dramatically, without warning. The Pleistocene epoch, which covered most of the Stone Age, was a time of wild climate swings. Ice ages that lasted tens of thousands of years, where glaciers covered huge portions of Europe and Asia and North America. Then interglacials, warm periods where the ice retreated and forests expanded. Then back to ice again, over and over, cycling every 100,000 years or so. Each swing changed everything. During ice ages, massive grasslands called mammoth steppes covered regions that are forests today. Herds of giant mammals, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, giant deer, they dominated these landscapes. Humans who lived in these regions had to become hunters. Had to. Because for half the year, plant foods essentially didn't exist. Everything was frozen. The only calories available were walking around on 4 legs wearing fur coats. During interglacials, forests expanded. Different animals thrived. Plant foods became abundant again. Humans could rely more on gathering, less on hunting. The entire rhythm of life changed with the climate. This meant humans were constantly adapting, not over millions of years, but over thousands, sometimes hundreds. Populations that specialized in hunting big game during ice ages had to completely change their strategies when the climate warmed and the forests returned. Groups that had relied heavily on plant foods during warm periods had to learn hunting techniques when the ice came back. There was no single Stone Age diet because there was no single Stone Age environment. Africa, where human digestion first evolved, was a mosaic of habitats. Rainforests near the equator, savannas dotted with acacia trees, mountain highlands, river valleys, coastal zones. Each region offered different food sources, each region selected for slightly different adaptations. The humans who stayed in Africa, who eventually became us, had to be generalists, had to be adaptable enough to eat whatever was available because African climates, while less extreme than the Ice Age North, still fluctuated enough to make specialization dangerous. Specialize too much on one food source, and you're dead when that food source disappears during a drought. Meanwhile, the humans who left Africa and spread across Europe and Asia, they could afford to specialize. Neanderthals evolved into cold weather specialists, master hunters perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe. They became so good at hunting large mammals that meat probably made up 70, 80, maybe 90% of their diet during winter months. Their bodies changed to match. Stockier builds, massive muscle mass, enormous caloric requirements. Then there were the mysterious Denisovans, the third human species that we barely know anything about except through their DNA. They spread across Asia, adapted to environments ranging from tropical Southeast Asia to the high-altitude Tibetan Plateau, each population eating differently, adapting differently, evolving differently. By 50,000 years ago, when our ancestors were sitting around that fire in southern France eating roasted hare and wild roots, they were the product of millions of years of dietary adaptation. Their guts had evolved to process meat. Their teeth had changed shape to handle both tough plant fibers and meat. Their brains had grown massive, fueled partly by the calorie-dense foods their ancestors had learned to exploit. But they were also incredibly flexible, because the lesson of the Stone Age wasn't about eating one perfect diet. It was about being able to eat anything, everything, whatever it took to survive until spring came again. This isn't some shameful secret. This is the foundation of everything that came after. The scavenger's table was where humanity learned to eat meat, and that decision, that adaptation, changed us more profoundly than almost anything else in our evolutionary history. The earliest evidence comes from a place called Dakika in Ethiopia. 3.4 million years ago, someone took a stone tool and scraped it across the rib bones of a large mammal, probably trying to strip off whatever meat the lions had left behind. Then they moved to a leg bone from a different animal and made cut marks there too. We know this because those marks are still visible, preserved in the fossilized bones. We can see the angle of the cut, the depth, even identify the type of stone tool that made them. These weren't sophisticated butchery techniques. These were the desperate scratchings of creatures who had no idea what they were doing, but were hungry enough to try anyway. The being who made those marks probably wasn't even in the genus Homo yet. This was earlier, deeper in our family tree. Australopithecus afarensis maybe, or something similar. Small-bodied, small-brained, still spending significant time in trees, but they were curious and probably desperate. Because here's the situation they were facing. The African climate was drying out, forests were shrinking, the fruit and leaves that their ancestors had relied on were becoming less reliable. They needed new food sources, or they needed to go extinct. Meat was everywhere. It was walking around on 4 legs, flying overhead, swimming in rivers. But actually killing animals when you weigh 90 pounds and your only weapons are your hands, that's not happening. Lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs, they were the predators. They had the teeth, the claws, the speed, the hunting instincts refined over millions of years of evolution. But they were also wasteful. A lion kills a zebra and eats maybe 30 pounds of meat. Then it gets full and wanders off to sleep in the shade. That leaves hundreds of pounds of perfectly good meat sitting there, rotting in the sun. Hyenas show up and take their share. Vultures circle down and pick at what's left. By the time everyone's had their turn, the carcass looks pretty grim. But there's still nutrition there. Locked inside the bones, bone marrow, this is important. This is the key that unlocked everything else. Marrow is basically concentrated fat and protein. It's one of the most nutrient-dense foods in nature. And predators, even big ones like lions, they can't get at it. Their teeth can crush bones to some extent, but not efficiently. Not the way they'd need to in order to extract every bit of marrow from a skeleton. So they leave it. They walk away from thousands of calories because their bodies aren't designed to access it. But a clever ape with a rock, that ape can smash bones open, can crack them apart and scoop out the creamy, calorie-rich marrow inside. Suddenly you've got access to a food source that almost nobody else is exploiting. A food source that's available at almost every kill site across the savannah. The evidence for this bone marrow hypothesis is written in the archaeological record. Stone tools from nearly 2 million years ago show specific wear patterns consistent with smashing bones, not just cutting meat. The bones themselves show impact fractures right where you'd hit them to extract marrow most efficiently. Our ancestors figured out bone geometry, figured out exactly where to strike to break open a femur or humerus and get at the good stuff inside. This created a survival strategy that nobody else was using. While the actual predators were sleeping off their kills and the other scavengers were fighting over meat scraps, our ancestors could show up late to the party, could wait until everyone else had left, then move in with their stone tools and systematically extract marrow from every bone in the carcass. Safer that way too. Less chance of confrontation with animals that could actually kill you. But this strategy required something new, required bodies that could travel, because kill sites were scattered across enormous territories. A lion pride might make a kill every few days, but never in the same place. Hyena clans ranged over hundreds of square miles. If you're going to base your survival on scavenging their kills, you need to be able to cover serious distance. This is where bipedalism becomes crucial. Walking upright on 2 legs isn't fast. Any predator can outrun you. But it's incredibly efficient. Modern humans can walk farther using less energy than almost any other mammal. Our ancestors couldn't run down prey, but they could walk all day, scanning the horizon for circling vultures, the universal sign that something had died and there might be food to scavenge. And your hands were free. This matters more than it sounds. 4-legged animals can't carry anything while they travel. Baboons can hold food in their mouths, but that's about it. But walking upright meant you could carry things, could take your stone tools with you, could even carry meat and bones back to a safer location where you could process them without worrying about being ambushed by whatever predator made the original kill. The social dynamics of this scavenging lifestyle must have been intense. You're competing with hyenas who can crush bones with their jaws, with vultures who can spot carcasses from miles away, with other groups of your own species who have figured out the same strategy and are trying to get to the good bones before you do. This probably drove the development of group coordination. One individual approaching a carcass where hyenas are still feeding is going to have a bad time. But 5 individuals working together, throwing rocks, yelling, making themselves look bigger and more threatening, that might be enough to scare off the hyenas and claim the carcass. For a while anyway, until something bigger shows up. There's evidence that different scavenging sites were used repeatedly, suggesting our ancestors learned which locations were most productive. Kill sites near water sources where prey animals came to drink. Narrow valleys where predators could ambush migrating herds. River crossings where animals drowned during seasonal floods. These became regular scavenging circuits, routes that groups travelled systematically, checking for fresh carcasses. But here's what really matters. What all this scavenging did to our brains. Meat and especially bone marrow are packed with nutrients that brain tissue needs. Omega-3 fatty acids, iron, zinc, B vitamins, protein with all the essential amino acids. This isn't available in plant foods, not in the same concentrations, not in the same bioavailable forms. Over hundreds of thousands of years, consistent access to these nutrients did something remarkable. Brain size started increasing. Not quickly, not dramatically at first, but steadily. Generation after generation, individuals with slightly larger brains had better problem-solving abilities. Could remember where good scavenging sites were. Could figure out more efficient ways to extract marrow. Could communicate better with their group members about where to find food. Those individuals survived better, reproduced more successfully, passed on genes for larger brains to their offspring. Natural selection at work, fueled by the nutritional abundance of the scavenger's table. By 2 million years ago, human brain size had increased by nearly 50% compared to our earlier ancestors. That's not coincidence. That's meat-eating and marrow-cracking selecting for intelligence. But scavenging was never safe. Never easy. You're competing with animals that evolved to kill. Every meal came with risk. Every carcass might have a leopard waiting nearby, unwilling to give up its kill to a gang of upright apes with rocks. The evidence shows our ancestors sometimes lost these confrontations, lost badly. Hominin fossils from this period occasionally show tooth marks from big cats, show evidence of being eaten, not just dying naturally. This was the reality of the scavenger's table. Dangerous, uncertain, but calorie-rich enough to be worth the risk. Rich enough to fuel the growth of bigger brains. Smart enough brains that eventually, maybe 1 million years later, humans would stop scavenging and start hunting. Would become the predators instead of living off the predators' scraps. But that transformation started here, with desperate creatures smashing bones in the African sun, hoping the hyenas wouldn't come back before they finished eating. Smashing bones and eating raw meat was transformative, but it had limits. Your gut could only extract so much nutrition from uncooked food. Your teeth could only grind through so much raw fiber. Your body spent enormous energy just trying to digest what you'd eaten, leaving less available for growing that expensive brain tissue. Then something happened that changed human evolution more profoundly than perhaps anything before or since. Someone figured out how to control fire, not just use it. Lightning strikes have been starting fires since forever. Our ancestors probably knew you could cook meat in the aftermath of a grassland blaze, but that's opportunistic. That's not the same as carrying fire with you, maintaining it, keeping it alive day after day. That requires a cognitive leap that sounds simple, but represents one of the most important technological achievements in human history. The earliest solid evidence comes from Wonderwerk Cave in South Africa. 1 million years ago, someone was building fires inside that cave repeatedly. We know because the cave sediments contain ash, charred bones, and burned stone tools in layers that span thousands of years. This wasn't accidental. This was controlled, sustained fire use. But the evidence gets murkier as you go further back. Some researchers claim fire control goes back 1.5 million years, maybe even 2 million. Others are skeptical, arguing the evidence is ambiguous, that many supposed ancient hearths could be natural fires that humans simply used opportunistically. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Fire control probably developed gradually, over hundreds of thousands of years. First just using natural fires when you found them, then learning to keep fires burning longer by feeding them fuel, eventually figuring out how to transport fire, carrying embers in containers, protecting them from rain and wind, and finally, though we don't know exactly when, learning to create fire on demand through friction or percussion. But whenever it happened, whenever our ancestors gained full control of fire, the consequences were staggering. Richard Wrangham, a primatologist at Harvard, has built an entire theory of human evolution around cooking. The cooking hypothesis argues that fire, specifically the ability to cook food, was the catalyst that allowed humans to develop large brains, complex social structures, and eventually dominate the planet. It's controversial, but the evidence keeps mounting in its favor. Here's why cooking matters so much. When you eat raw food, your digestive system has to break down tough cell walls, denature proteins, and gelatinize starches all on its own. This requires enormous energy and takes hours, sometimes the better part of a day for foods like raw tubers. Your gut has to be large, muscular, and metabolically expensive just to handle the processing load. Fire does all that work before the food enters your mouth. Heat breaks down collagen in meat, turning tough tissue into something tender. It ruptures plant cell walls, making nutrients accessible that would otherwise pass through undigested. It gelatinizes starches in roots and tubers, converting them from hard, bitter, nearly indigestible lumps into soft, sweet, calorie-rich food. Most importantly, cooking kills pathogens and parasites, making food safer and allowing your immune system to spend less energy fighting off diseases from contaminated meals. The energy savings are massive. Studies of modern primates show they spend something like 6 hours a day just chewing. Gorillas spend even longer, but cooking reduces chewing time dramatically. It reduces the energy cost of digestion by up to 50%. Suddenly you've got all this surplus energy that your body doesn't need to spend on processing raw food. Where does that energy go? Into the brain. Brain tissue is metabolically expensive, burning about 20% of your body's energy budget despite being only 2% of your body weight. For most species, growing a bigger brain would be impossible because there simply isn't enough energy available. But with cooking, suddenly the energy is there. The freed up calories can be redirected from gut maintenance to brain growth. The anatomical evidence supports this. Around 1.8 million years ago, right when controlled fire use might have been developing, something dramatic happens to human bodies. The gut shrinks, teeth get smaller, jaws become less robust. The massive chewing muscles that attach to heavy skull bones start reducing in size, allowing skulls to become more gracile, more rounded. Brain cases start expanding. This is the signature of cooking written in bone. Bodies adapting to a cooked food diet, losing the equipment needed for processing raw food, gaining the lighter, more efficient anatomy that a fire-using species can get away with. By the time Homo erectus appears in the fossil record, humans look fundamentally different from their predecessors. Smaller guts, smaller teeth, vastly larger brains. The proportions have shifted in ways that only make sense if cooking had become central to survival. The social consequences might have been even more profound than the anatomical ones. Fire creates a gathering point. For the first time in evolutionary history, humans had a reason to return to the same location every evening. The hearth became the center of social life. You couldn't wander off because the fire needed tending, needed feeding. Someone had to keep watch to make sure it didn't go out or spread where it shouldn't. This created new social dynamics, extended families gathering around the fire after dark. Previously, sunset meant finding a safe place to sleep, probably in trees or on cliff faces, anywhere predators couldn't easily reach. Sleep came early because there was nothing else to do in the darkness. But fire extended the usable day, provided light and warmth for hours after sunset, created a protected space where predators who feared flames wouldn't venture. What did people do with those extra hours? They talked. They shared information about where food could be found. They taught children how to make tools, how to find water, how to recognize dangerous plants. They told stories. The hearth became a classroom, a newsroom, a theatre. Language probably existed before cooking, but fire created the social context where complex communication became not just useful, but essential. And cooking itself required planning, patience, and knowledge transfer. You had to know which foods needed cooking and which didn't, had to understand that some foods, like certain roots and tubers, were toxic when raw but safe when cooked. Had to learn the right cooking times, the right temperatures, the right techniques. This knowledge had to be passed down deliberately, taught to each generation. Oral tradition probably began around the cooking fire. What were they actually cooking? Meat, certainly. Evidence from many sites shows burned animal bones with cut marks, indicating butchered meat was being roasted, but meat was probably the minority of cooked calories. Hunter-gatherers across all environments rely heavily on plant foods, and our Stone Age ancestors were almost certainly no exception. Underground storage organs, tubers, roots, bulbs, these would have been staples. Many are nearly inedible, raw, tough and bitter and full of defensive compounds that plants evolved to discourage animals from eating them. But cooking transforms them. A bitter, rock-hard wild yam becomes sweet and soft after an hour buried in hot coals. Seeds too. Many wild seeds contain toxins or tough coatings that protect them from digestion. Cooking neutralizes the toxins and softens the coatings. This opened up entire categories of food that previous humans couldn't access efficiently. The African savanna might have looked empty to a chimpanzee, but to a human with fire it was full of potential calories just waiting to be unlocked through heat. The cooking fire was also where food preservation probably began. Smoke from the fire would permeate meat hung nearby, helping preserve it for days or weeks instead of hours. This created surplus for the first time. You didn't have to eat everything immediately, could cook large quantities when food was abundant and save some for leaner times. This surplus allowed for more complex social arrangements, gift-giving, reciprocity, the building blocks of the elaborate exchange networks that would characterize later human societies. We are the species that cooks. No other animal does this systematically. Some use tools, some hunt cooperatively, some even have culture in rudimentary forms. But only humans transform our food with fire before eating it. And that single innovation, that one technological leap, rewired our bodies and our societies more completely than we often realize. Every time you turn on a stove, you're participating in a tradition that goes back 1,000,000 years, a tradition that literally made us human. Cooking transformed what our ancestors could eat, but it didn't change what they wanted to eat most: meat, fat, the dense calories that came from animals. And somewhere between 2 million and 500,000 years ago, depending on which evidence you trust, humans stopped being opportunistic scavengers and became something far more dangerous. Active hunters, systematic predators who could track, pursue and kill animals much larger than themselves. The transition wasn't sudden. Early Homo erectus probably still scavenged whenever they could. Why waste energy hunting when you could just chase a leopard off its kill? But scavenging has limitations. You're dependent on other predators doing the work. You're eating leftovers, often the scraps that carnivores with better teeth and stronger jaws left behind. And you're always in competition with other scavengers, always at risk from the predator who made the kill in the first place. Hunting meant independence, meant choosing your target, meant getting first access to the richest parts of the carcass. But it required a complete reimagining of what a primate body could do. Chimpanzees occasionally hunt, usually going after small monkeys. They're reasonably good at it, using coordinated tactics to drive prey into ambush positions. But they're built for power and climbing, not endurance. They overheat quickly. Their hunting is opportunistic, explosive, brief. Humans evolved something entirely different. Not strength or speed, but relentless, impossible endurance. The ability to run for hours in conditions that would kill most other mammals. Persistence hunting, anthropologists call it. The art of chasing an animal until it literally collapses from heat exhaustion. Here's how it works. You spot a herd of antelope on the African savanna at midday when the sun is at its highest. Most predators are sleeping through the heat, but you're just getting started. You select your target, usually an individual that's young or slightly injured or somehow vulnerable. Then you start running, not sprinting. Jogging, really, a pace you can maintain for hours. The antelope bolts, of course. It's vastly faster than you over short distances. It disappears over a hill and you think that's the end of it. But you're a tracker. You can read the signs it left behind, the prints in the dust, the disturbed vegetation. You follow, not frantically, just steadily. You know something the antelope doesn't. You know that you're going to win. The antelope stops a mile away, panting heavily. Its body wasn't built for extended running in heat. It has fur, which traps heat. It cools itself by panting, which is inefficient compared to sweating, and critically it can only breathe at certain gaits. When it gallops, its breathing is locked to its stride. It can't increase its breathing rate independently to cool down faster. You arrive at that spot 15 minutes later, still jogging, barely winded. The antelope sees you coming and bolts again. Another sprint, another period of desperate fleeing. But each time it runs, its core temperature rises a little more. Each time it stops, it needs a little longer to recover. And each time you arrive shortly after, implacable, relentless, terrifyingly consistent. After 3, 4, 5 repetitions of this chase, the antelope is in serious trouble. Its temperature is approaching dangerous levels. It's getting clumsy, making mistakes. Eventually, after maybe 3 hours of pursuit, it simply can't run anymore. It stands there, overheated to the point of collapse. You walk up and kill it with a spear thrust or heavy rock. It barely tries to flee. This hunting method sounds insane, but it works. Anthropologists have documented modern sand hunters in the Kalahari Desert using these exact techniques, and it explains almost everything unusual about human anatomy. We're not built like any other primate because we're not adapted for climbing or power. We're adapted for running in heat. Look at human hair distribution, or rather, the lack of it. We're effectively hairless compared to other apes, with over 2 million sweat glands covering our bodies. Those sweat glands are our superpower. They let us dump heat through evaporative cooling far more efficiently than any other large mammal. A human running in midday heat can maintain a stable core temperature, while the animal we're chasing slowly cooks from the inside. Our leg anatomy is equally specialized. The Achilles tendon, that thick cord running from your calf muscle to your heel, acts like a spring, storing and releasing energy with each stride. It makes running far more efficient. Chimpanzees barely have one. It's a running adaptation, refined over millions of years of persistence hunting. So is the gluteus maximus, the largest muscle in the human body. It's mostly useless for walking, but crucial for stabilizing the body during running. Other primates have much smaller versions. Even our inner ear is adapted for running. The semicircular canals that control balance are enlarged in humans, giving us better stabilization during the head movement that comes with extended running. We're persistence hunting machines, evolved down to the neurological level for chasing prey across open country under the merciless sun. But what were they actually hunting? That varied enormously by region and time period. In Africa, the menu included everything from small antelope to juvenile elephants, gazelles, wildebeest, zebras, whatever was available and vulnerable. In Europe, Neanderthals and early modern humans went after much larger game. Woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant elk. Dangerous, challenging animals that could fight back. Island Southeast Asia had dwarf elephants and giant lizards. Each region developed its own hunting traditions, its own specialized knowledge about local species. And they weren't just hunting for meat. Modern people, when they think about hunting, think about steaks and roasts, the muscle tissue. But our ancestors knew better. They were after fat. Specifically, they wanted the fattiest parts of the animal, the organs and deposits that modern Western cultures often discard. The brain, the bone marrow, the kidney fat, the deposits around the organs. These were the prizes. Fat contains more than twice the calories per gram as protein or carbohydrates. In environments where starvation was a constant threat, fat was survival. The human body can only process so much protein. Eat nothing but lean meat, and you'll develop protein poisoning, a dangerous condition early explorers called rabbit starvation because it commonly struck people trying to survive on lean game. But fat has no such limitation. You can derive the majority of your calories from fat and thrive. Archaeological sites tell this story clearly. Bones are often found cracked open, the marrow extracted. Skulls are broken to access the brain. These weren't people carelessly smashing bones. They were systematically targeting the richest fat deposits with practiced precision. They knew exactly which bones contained the most marrow, exactly how to crack them without shattering the valuable contents. The hunting was also deeply seasonal. Our ancestors weren't just randomly pursuing whatever they saw. They understood animal behavior across the full annual cycle. They knew when herds would be migrating through certain valleys, knew which water sources animals would be forced to visit during dry seasons, knew when prey would be fat, loaded with calories before winter, versus lean after a hard season. This knowledge took generations to accumulate, passed down through oral tradition, refined by countless observations. Some groups developed specialized techniques, driving herds toward cliffs where animals would panic and fall to their deaths, building funnel-shaped traps that concentrated prey in kill zones, creating ambush points along regular migration routes. These weren't opportunistic tactics. These were sophisticated strategies requiring planning, coordination, and detailed understanding of landscape and animal psychology. And they succeeded spectacularly. By 40,000 years ago, human hunters had spread across every continent except Antarctica. They'd learned to take down the largest land mammals on Earth, had developed throwing spears, and eventually atlatls and bows, weapons that let them kill from a distance with minimal risk. They'd become the planet's apex predator not through strength or speed, but through intelligence, endurance, and the terrifying patience to chase prey until physics itself became the weapon. But here's what almost every popular account of Stone Age life gets catastrophically wrong. The focus on hunting, on meat, on our ancestors as fearless predators stalking across the landscape. It makes for dramatic storytelling. It fits nicely with certain narratives about human nature and evolutionary success. It's also wildly misleading about what people actually ate most of the time. The reality is that plant foods probably comprise somewhere between 50 and 80% of the diet for most Stone Age populations most of the time, not as supplement to meat, as the foundation of subsistence, the primary source of calories, the thing that kept people alive between successful hunts. And we've known this for decades from studies of modern foraging societies. But somehow the meat-centric myth persists. Think about the basic mathematics of hunting. Even skilled hunters in favorable environments might only make a significant kill every few days, sometimes longer. Weather turns bad, herds move away, you get injured, the hunt fails for any of 1,000 reasons. You can't just decide to eat meat today and have it magically appear. But plants are everywhere. They don't run away. They're predictable, harvestable, reliable in ways that hunting never was. They were the safety net, the guaranteed calories that filled the gaps between successful hunts. The gathering economy that supported most Stone Age populations was incredibly diverse. Roots and tubers dug from the earth, sometimes from several feet down. Fruits picked from trees and bushes in their season. Nuts collected and processed, some requiring elaborate preparation to make them edible. Seeds from wild grasses painstakingly gathered and ground. Leaves from certain plants at certain times of year. Flowers that were edible for brief periods. The inner bark of specific trees. Mushrooms when conditions were right. The menu was vast and constantly changing with the seasons. Underground storage organs, things like tubers and corms, were probably the most important plant foods in many environments. These are the parts of plants that store energy underground, protected from temperature extremes and many predators. Think wild versions of potatoes, yams, taro. They're dense in carbohydrates, can often be stored after harvesting, and critically they're available year-round if you know where to look. When surface resources dried up during dry seasons, when fruits weren't fruiting and nuts weren't available, you could still dig up tubers. They were famine insurance, but harvesting them required knowledge and effort. You needed to recognize the above-ground parts of plants during their brief visible periods, remember the locations, then return months later when the above-ground parts had died back. You needed digging sticks strong enough to excavate hard soil, knowledge of how deep different species stored their tubers, understanding of which ones required cooking or processing to remove toxins before eating. This wasn't simple foraging. This was botanical expertise accumulated over generations. The plant knowledge of Stone Age peoples would have been staggering by modern standards. They needed to know hundreds of species, which ones were edible in which seasons, which parts were safe and which were toxic, which required processing and what specific techniques made them edible, how to identify them at different growth stages, where they grew and when they'd be ready for harvest. This knowledge was survival. Getting it wrong meant poisoning. Forgetting it meant starvation. Some plants required elaborate processing that would never be obvious without cultural transmission. Certain acorns contain high levels of tannins that make them bitter and toxic, but leach them in running water for days and they become nutritious staples. Some roots are deadly unless properly prepared but provide crucial calories once processed. Modern experiments with foraging typically fail because people don't have this accumulated knowledge. They try to figure things out from scratch and quickly discover that most wild plants are either inedible, unpalatable, or require processing techniques that aren't intuitively obvious. We know this dietary diversity existed because we've found it written in the most unexpected place, inside the hardened plaque on ancient teeth. Dental calculus, that crusty build-up that dentists scrape off during cleanings, traps microscopic particles of whatever you've been eating, and unlike most organic material, it preserves for tens of thousands of years. Archaeologists have been analysing this material for the past couple decades, and what they've found has revolutionised our understanding of Stone Age diets. The calculus from Stone Age teeth contains microscopic plant remains representing astonishing diversity. starch grains from roots and tubers, phytoliths, the silica structures from grasses and other plants, pollen from flowers, plant fibers from leaves and stems, chemical signatures from dozens of plant species. Some specimens show evidence of over 50 different plant types being consumed by a single individual. This isn't supplementary eating. This is systematic exploitation of the full botanical environment. Even more remarkably, the evidence shows sophisticated food processing, heated starch grains indicating cooking, ground plant particles suggesting the use of grinding stones, chemical modifications that only happen with certain preparation techniques. Our ancestors weren't just eating whatever raw plants they stumbled across. They were processing, preparing, and probably combining plants in ways that maximize nutrition and palatability. And here's the part that popular narratives consistently fail to acknowledge. In most foraging societies, we can actually observe women do the majority of gathering while men focus primarily on hunting. This probably wasn't a rigid division. People were flexible, doing whatever work needed doing. But as a general pattern, women's gathering activities provided the majority of calories, the reliable foundation of subsistence. The meat from hunting was important, providing crucial fats and proteins. But it was women's plant knowledge, women's daily gathering labour, that kept communities fed through lean periods and seasonal shortages. The economic backbone of Stone Age life wasn't the dramatic hunt. It was the patient, systematic gathering of plant foods that happened every single day. Different regions developed specializations based on what was locally abundant. In parts of Africa, mongongo nuts became a staple. They're incredibly nutritious, can be stored for long periods, and were abundant enough that some groups could rely on them as a primary food source. Archaeological sites show mongongo nuts being consumed for thousands of years, generation after generation returning to the same groves, managing them, protecting them, building seasonal rounds around their harvest. In Europe, hazelnuts filled a similar role. Sites dating back tens of thousands of years show massive accumulations of hazelnut shells. Not scattered randomly, but concentrated in specific areas, suggesting deliberate collection, processing, and possibly storage. These were managed resources, not opportunistic snacks. In the Middle East, wild cereals, the ancestors of wheat and barley, grew in dense stands that could be harvested systematically. There's evidence that people were processing these grains, grinding them into flour, long before agriculture developed. They understood their nutritional value and had developed the tools and techniques to make them edible. This plant-focused reality of Stone Age diet matters because it changes everything about how we understand human evolution and adaptation. We didn't evolve primarily as carnivores who occasionally ate plants. We evolved as flexible omnivores who could exploit whatever resources were available, with plant foods providing the consistent caloric foundation and meat providing crucial nutrients and fats when available. The story is far more complex, far less dramatic, and far more interesting than the simple hunting narrative allows. But plants were only half the story. To really understand what our Stone Age ancestors ate and what it did to their bodies, you have to follow them somewhere else entirely, to the edge of the land, to the places where rock meets water, where tides breathe in and out, and the world smells like salt and rotting seaweed. For a long time, archaeologists assumed that serious use of the sea came late, that early humans were landlocked hunters and gatherers who only occasionally wandered down to the beach to grab whatever washed up. The ocean was treated almost like a stage backdrop, dramatic, but not really part of the plot. That view is disappearing. More and more evidence suggests that some of the smartest bets our ancestors ever made were made on coastlines. In fact, one of the most influential ideas in recent human evolution, the coastal migration theory, is built around this simple observation. Shorelines are cheat codes. Imagine you're part of a small band leaving Africa. Inland, resources are patchy. You have to know the plants, follow the herds, keep complicated seasonal calendars in your head. One bad year and you might starve. Now picture hugging the coast instead. You move along beaches, rocky shores, estuaries, mangrove swamps. Everywhere you go, the same broad categories of resources are waiting for you. Shellfish, crabs, small fish trapped in tidal pools, seaweed, shorebirds and their eggs, carcasses of marine animals washed ashore. Inland ecosystems differ wildly from place to place. Coasts are surprisingly predictable. The tides rise and fall with clockwork regularity. Many shellfish are just sitting there, attached to rocks or buried in shallow sand, waiting for anyone with hands and a little patience. Follow a coastline, and you can walk thousands of miles while still recognizing the basics of your food supply. This is the core of the coastal migration idea, that some of the early expansions of our species, out of Africa, into Arabia, down through India, along Southeast Asia, all the way to Australia, may have been powered not by heroic big game hunts, but by humble, steady, reliable shore foraging. People simply followed the edge of the sea, moving bit by bit into new territory, never too far from their next meal. We see an early version of this strategy in one of the most important coastal sites ever found, Pinnacle Point on the southern coast of South Africa. Picture a rugged stretch of shoreline, steep cliffs facing an often violent ocean, caves carved into the rock, some open to the light, others stretching deep into darkness. And inside those caves, in layers of sediment more than 160,000 years old, archaeologists found something that changed how we think about human diet. Mountains of shells, mussels, limpets, other shellfish species piled up in dense layers called middens, ancient garbage dumps of eaten meals. Some of these deposits have been dated to around 164,000 years ago. That's long before the famous European cave art, long before the last ice age reached its peak, long before most of the iconic Stone Age scenes people imagine. These shells tell us that early Homo sapiens weren't just occasionally nibbling on coastal foods, they were systematically harvesting the sea, and they weren't doing it randomly. The shells show signs of size selection. People were probably choosing individuals big enough to be worth the effort. Burn marks suggest they were cooking them, using heat to open the shells and make them safer and easier to eat. Some layers come and go seasonally, implying that groups were returning to these caves at particular times of year when shellfish were at their best. Pinnacle Point isn't unique. Other South African coastal sites show similar patterns, as do later sites in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. Wherever humans had access to productive shores, they seem to have tapped into them with enthusiasm. Why? Because from an evolutionary perspective, coastal foods are almost unfairly valuable. Most of the nutrients required to build and maintain an energy-hungry brain are hard to get in abundance from terrestrial environments. But shorelines concentrate them. Take DHA, for example, docosahexaenoic acid, a long-chain omega-3 fatty acid that's a critical structural component of the human brain and retina. Your neurons literally build their membranes out of it. You can synthesize a bit from plant precursors, but the process is inefficient. Rich direct sources are rare on land. In the sea they're everywhere: fatty fish, shellfish, marine mammals, even some seaweeds. They all sit on top of a marine food web packed with omega-3s. Eat from that web regularly, and your diet becomes a continuous supply line for brain-building fats. Then there's iodine, another nutrient humans absolutely need for proper brain development and thyroid function. Inland, iodine can be scarce and irregularly distributed. Along coasts, it's abundant in seafood and seaweeds. Other trace elements important for neural function cluster there too: zinc, selenium, certain B vitamins. Put these together and you get a remarkable package. shoreside ecosystems that offer protein, fat, and precisely the kind of micronutrients a large, fast-developing brain craves. This has led some researchers to suggest that frequent exploitation of marine resources may have helped accelerate cognitive evolution in certain human populations. Not as a magic switch, not as eat oysters, become a genius, but as a steady nutritional background that made it easier for big, complex brains to develop, function, and reproduce successfully. We can't prove a direct cause and effect line. Evolution is never that simple, but the timing is intriguing. Some of the earliest evidence for what archaeologists call behavioral modernity, complex tools, symbolic use of pigments, structured use of space, shows up in coastal sites that also show intensive marine foraging. People gathering shellfish, exploiting tidal zones, and at the same time leaving behind evidence of increasingly sophisticated mines. And the coastline menu wasn't limited to shellfish. As time goes on, we start seeing clearer and clearer hints that our ancestors weren't just picking up what the sea offered. They were actively hunting in it. In parts of Africa and later in Europe and Asia, archaeologists find barbed bone points, elegant, carefully shaped implements with backward-facing teeth that help keep a struggling animal from escaping once it's been speared. These aren't great for stabbing big land mammals. They excel in water, where the drag of liquid can help set the barbs, and where prey-like fish and aquatic mammals can be slippery and hard to hold. Alongside these tools, we find fish bones in quantities and patterns that don't look like random scavenging. Species that live in deep water, or that are most easily caught with traps, nets, or specialized hooks. Evidence of large-scale exploitation of salmon runs. Signs of people taking advantage of spawning seasons, tides, and currents. To do this well, you have to understand aquatic ecosystems in detail. You need to know when certain fish migrate, when shellfish are safe versus toxic, how tides affect where animals concentrate, how to build traps that work with currents rather than against them, and we start to see signs of people organizing their movements around these patterns. Seasonal coastal camps appear in the archaeological record, sites that seem to have been occupied at particular times of year, used intensively, then abandoned as groups moved inland or along the coast. These weren't random stopovers. They were scheduled returns to known resource hotspots, often coordinated with other seasonal events on land, plant harvests, animal migrations, weather cycles. For people living this way, the year wasn't just a simple alternation of wet and dry, hot and cold. It was a rotating calendar of opportunities. The shellfish are best in this bay in early spring. The fish run up this river in late summer. These seabirds nest here in early winter. Each event offering specific foods with specific nutritional profiles. Coasts also offered something else crucial for small, vulnerable primates trying to survive in a dangerous world. Low-risk calories. Think back to hunting large animals. You can get a huge payoff, but you're facing obvious dangers. Trampling, goring, long chases that can lead to injury or failure. The energy investment is high. The risk of coming home empty-handed is real. Now picture shellfish gathering. You wait for low tide, walk out onto the rocks, pry limpets from stones, dig clams from wet sand. It's repetitive, sometimes cold and uncomfortable, but the risk of catastrophic injury is minimal. Children and older people can help. You can collect enough for a family in a few hours. For a species whose survival strategy increasingly depended on cooperative groups, long childhoods, and elders who stored knowledge, this kind of low-risk, shareable food mattered. It supported babies, nursing mothers, and people past their physical prime but still cognitively sharp. It made it easier to maintain larger, more stable communities. And because so much of coastal foraging relies on timing, prediction, and shared maps of the environment, it likely rewarded good communication. Knowing when to go, where to gather, how to avoid dangerous rip currents or poisonous species. These are things best transmitted through teaching, story, and eventually language. Along the world's ancient shorelines, our ancestors weren't just filling their stomachs. They were quietly feeding their brains with nutrients, with information, with social coordination. So while the classic image of human evolution often centers on the savannah hunt, spear in hand, there's another equally important scene playing out at the same time. Families walking across glistening tidal flats at dawn, baskets or skin bags in hand. Children learning to spot the faint depression that marks a buried clam. Elders pointing out a rocky outcrop and saying in whatever language they spoke, "Here, when the moon is big and the water falls low, the food is always good." Those shorelines became launch pads, nutritionally, cognitively, and geographically. They nourished bodies, buffered against famine, and may have given certain populations just enough of an edge, just enough of a boost in brain function and social complexity, to push human evolution along one more notch. From there, our cousins would carry their coastal knowledge into colder waters and different seas, and on another set of shores far to the north and west, a very different kind of shoreline specialist was perfecting its own menu. When we follow that trail of shoreline specialists north into Ice Age Europe, we don't just meet cavemen, we meet Neanderthals. For a long time their menu was written in caricature, heavy-browed brutes gnawing roasted mammoth haunches in smoky caves, pure meat machines who spent every waking hour thinking about the next hunt. The reality emerging from their bones, teeth and hearths is stranger, subtler, and in many ways more impressive. Yes, Neanderthals were formidable hunters. In some regions they really did sit at the top of the food web, rivaling wolves and big cats. But they were also careful observers of plants, flexible foragers, cooks, and at times desperate enough or ritualistic enough to eat each other. Their diet wasn't a single stereotype. It was a patchwork tuned to landscape, climate, and season. Start in the cold north, Ice Age France, Germany, Belgium, open steppe, scattered forests, winters that dragged on, summers that were short and intense. Here, the chemistry in Neanderthal bones tells a clear story. When scientists analyze nitrogen and carbon isotopes locked in ancient collagen, they're essentially reading a dietary fingerprint. Herbivores cluster at one level, predators at another. In site after site in northern and central Europe, Neanderthal signatures sit up high, right alongside apex carnivores, sometimes above them. In places like Vindiger Cave in Croatia or Grotte du Renne in France, Neanderthal isotope values suggest a diet dominated by large herbivores, mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, steppe bison, giant deer, not just occasionally, habitually. They weren't nibbling on scraps left by lions. They were the lions. To sustain that, they needed an entire culture of hunting, group coordination, knowledge of animal migrations, the courage and strength to confront creatures that could kill a human with a single kick. Their skeletons bear the cost, healed fractures, compressed spines, injuries that look eerily like what modern rodeo riders accumulate. In that environment, meat and fat were survival. Plants were there, but for much of the year, calorie-rich, easily digestible plant foods were scarce or buried under snow and ice. It makes sense that the northern Neanderthal menu leaned heavily toward animal tissue. But move south, toward the Mediterranean, into what is now Spain, Italy, Greece, and the picture softens, complicates. In warmer, more forested landscapes with milder winters, Neanderthals had options, and they took them. Layers from sites like Gibraltar and coastal Italy contain not only the bones of red deer and ibex, but also traces of shellfish, marine mammals, pine nuts, acorns, wild legumes. Microscopic plant remains stuck in hearth ash, and on stone tools whisper of tubers, seeds, perhaps even grains being processed and eaten. The stereotype of the single-minded carnivore starts to crumble here. These southern Neanderthals seem to have been more like mixed foragers, still lethal hunters, but also careful gatherers of what the landscape offered. One cave in northern Spain, El Cedron, gives us an unusually intimate glimpse into this broader menu, not from bones, but from plaque. When living teeth accumulate dental calculus, that hard mineralized tartar, they trap tiny fragments of whatever passed through the mouth. Plant starch grains, bits of charcoal, bacterial DNA. For tens of thousands of years, those fragments can sit there, entombed, waiting for someone with a microscope and the right questions. At El Cedron, researchers examined the dental calculus of several Neanderthals who lived around 49,000 years ago. What they found reads like a tiny, ghostly recipe list. Starches from grasses and possibly wild barley that had been heated before consumption, suggesting some kind of cooking or roasting. Traces of nuts and mosses, chemical signatures of bitter plants like yarrow and chamomile, species with little or no calorie value but known medicinal properties as anti-inflammatories and digestive aids. These weren't random bits of forest debris accidentally chewed. The pattern suggests intentional selection and, in at least one individual, something like self-medication. A Neanderthal with evidence of a dental abscess and gut parasites appears to have been consuming plants that, in modern herbal medicine, are used to alleviate similar ailments. Fire residues in the same calculus show that much of what they ate had been cooked. Not just meat, but plants too. So, on one side, we have isotope data from colder regions painting Neanderthals as hypercarnivores. On the other, dental and archaeological evidence from milder regions that show them experimenting with plant foods, herbs, and perhaps even primitive pharmacology. These two pictures aren't contradictions. They're a map of regional variation. Neanderthals, like us, adapted their diets to where they lived. In pine forests above the Mediterranean, it made sense to crack open fat-rich pine nuts, soak and roast acorns to leach out toxins, chew on seeds and roots that could be softened by heat. Along warmer coasts they snapped up mussels, limpets, seals, and dolphins just like our Homo sapiens ancestors did further south. Deep in the frozen heart of Europe, where winter shut down most plant life, they shifted into near total reliance on meat and marrow. Wherever they lived, they cooked. We find Neanderthal hearths across their range, concentrations of charcoal, reddened earth, cracked bones, and heat-altered stones arranged in patterns that scream controlled fire rather than random wildfires. Around these hearths, there are clues to how they prepared their food. Some stones show repeated cycles of heating and rapid cooling, consistent with a technique called stone boiling. You heat rocks in a fire, then drop them into a container of water, a skin bag, a bark vessel, a shallow pit lined with hide. To bring the water to a simmer, drop in meat strips, roots, or seeds, and you have a kind of stew or broth. We don't find many of the containers themselves. Soft materials rarely survive for tens of thousands of years. But the physics of those burned and cracked stones, combined with ethnographic parallels from recent hunter-gatherers, make stone boiling a strong candidate for Neanderthal cooking. Grinding marks on some stones and where patterns on certain tools suggest they were also processing plants. Grinding seeds into meal, pounding fibrous roots to make them more digestible. Even a basic mashing or pre-chewing of tough food would have changed its nutritional impact, making more calories accessible, easing the burden on teeth and gut. None of this lines up with the old image of Neanderthals as clumsy, unimaginative eaters. They knew how to transform their food, but not every trace they left behind is comforting. At a number of sites, El Cedron again, Krapina in Croatia, Moulagursi in France, Neanderthal bones themselves bear the marks of butchery. cut marks in the same places you'd slice to remove meat from an animal limb, cracked long bones clearly open to access marrow, skull fragments broken in patterns consistent with brains being extracted. Often, these human remains lie mixed with animal bones that show identical treatment. This is strong evidence for cannibalism. What it meant is less clear. In some contexts like Mula Gyersi, the pattern suggests simple, unsentimental consumption. A small group reusing a cave, processing human bodies in the same way they processed deer, likely under intense resource stress, perhaps during a hard winter or following some crisis. In others, the situation is harder to read. Some skeletons show signs of careful placement or partial burial alongside evidence of defleshing, hinting at more complex behaviours, possibly ritual manipulation of the dead, perhaps a mixture of reverence and practicality that doesn't map cleanly onto any single modern category. Whatever the motives, the presence of cannibalism in their archaeological record tells us two important things about Neanderthal life. First, their food security could fail. Even skilled hunters and foragers could be pushed into extremes by climate swings, prey crashes, or social turmoil. Second, their relationship with the dead was not simple. Alongside clear cases of cannibalism, we also have Neanderthal burials where bodies seem to have been laid deliberately in pits, sometimes with grave goods or sprinkled pigments. They could treat some bodies as food and others as something more, individuals worthy of ritual, memory, or care. Their diet, like their culture, had layers. When we compare this to early Homo sapiens in the same broad regions, another pattern emerges. Both species could be formidable meat-eaters. Both could cook, use fire, exploit plants, and occasionally practice cannibalism. But our lineage seems to have leaned harder into flexibility. In many mixed occupation sites, caves and shelters where layers of Neanderthal and modern human use alternate, the Homo sapiens levels often show a broader spectrum of foods. More small game, more fish, more birds, more systematic use of tiny seeds and tough underground storage organs. Stone toolkits shift toward finer points, and composite tools suited to trapping and snaring, not just close-range thrusting. Where Neanderthals specialized, we diversified. That doesn't mean Neanderthals were rigid or foolish. It means they had evolved into superb big-game hunters in harsh seasonal environments, a strategy that worked brilliantly for hundreds of thousands of years until climates swung rapidly and a new competitor arrived that could wring calories from almost anything. In the end, that dietary plasticity may have given our ancestors a subtle but crucial edge. When a herd failed, we could pivot to fish. When winters lengthened, we leaned on nuts and stored plant foods. When landscapes fragmented, we threaded our way through new niches, stitching together calories from dozens of sources. Neanderthals, our powerful, skillful cousins, show us a different path. A body and culture honed to dominate a specific ecological role, to rule the icy steppe as predator kings. Their menu was rich, complex, and at times astonishingly sophisticated. It built bodies of dense bone and corded muscle, fueled huge brains, and sustained them through glacial storms. But in a world where climates wobbled and resources shifted, being a master of one table was no longer enough. Our species survived by becoming connoisseurs of many. And some of those many are foods we'd rather not think about. The crawling, buzzing, wriggling protein sources that kept countless Stone Age stomachs from going empty when bigger prey vanished into the snow. In the modern West, we tend to treat insects as a dare, something you eat on a reality show, a novelty candy at a tourist trap, or a symbol of desperation in post-apocalyptic fiction. For most of our evolutionary history, they were none of those things. They were dinner, or at least a reliable side dish. If you zoom out and look at the deep time of human and pre-human evolution, one pattern keeps showing up. Big animals are boom and bust, plants are seasonal and fickle, but insects are almost always there. They hide in logs, they swarm after rains, they pack themselves into hives, colonies and mounds. Concentrated bundles of fat, protein and minerals waiting to be tapped by anything clever and persistent enough to get at them. This is the basis of what some researchers call the entomophagy hypothesis. The idea that eating insects wasn't a weird exception, but a quiet, consistent thread running through our dietary past. Not every day, not everywhere, but often enough, and predictably enough, that our ancestors could depend on them when other foods failed. You don't have to imagine this from scratch. You can see echoes of it in the world today. Among many modern hunter-gatherers, insects are not last resort famine foods. They are seasonal delicacies, everyday snacks, and important staples. The Hadza of Tanzania, the same group whose honey-gathering skills we'll come back to, prize the fatty larvae of wild bees and other insects. The San of southern Africa harvest winged termites during their nuptial flights, knocking them down with branches or catching them over fires. In parts of the Amazon, some groups time their movements to the ripening of palm grubs, fat-loaded larvae that grow in rotting trunks. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples traditionally sought out witchetty grubs, digging them from the roots of certain plants and eating them raw or lightly cooked. In many of these cultures, a basket of roasted termites or a handful of grubs isn't something you gag down to survive. It's something children look forward to, adults gossip over, and elders remember from specific seasons and places. The pattern is so widespread across so many environments that it's hard to argue insects were somehow beneath our ancestors' dignity. In caloric terms, they certainly didn't behave like inferior foods. Nutritionally, insects are tiny powerhouses. Most edible insects are rich in complete protein, often matching or exceeding lean beef on a gram-for-gram basis. Many carry significant amounts of fat, especially the larvae and pupae, which function as little nutrient storage tanks. They come loaded with micronutrients, iron, zinc, B vitamins, sometimes even surprisingly high levels of calcium if the exoskeleton is chewed and swallowed. If you imagine a Stone Age child clutching a roasted grasshopper, nutritionally, what they're holding is something like a multivitamin wrapped in bacon. And crucially, the energy costs are low. You can spend days tracking a single antelope and come back bruised and empty-handed. Or you can walk to a termite mound, crack it open at the right time of year, and come away with thousands of individual mouthfuls. Termite mounds, in this sense, were some of the earliest grocery stores in our evolutionary story. We see hints of this even before our own species appears. At sites associated with early hominins, species like Australopithecus and early Homo, researchers have found stone tools with wear patterns and microscopic damage that look a lot like those produced when you dig into hard earth or break open insect nests. Some fossilized bones show traces of soil and termite activity in contexts that suggest deliberate disturbance rather than random scavenging. Chimpanzees today will use sticks to fish for termites, carefully inserting and withdrawing plant probes covered in biting insects. It doesn't take much imagination to extend that behavior to our tool-using ancestors. Hands already adept at shaping stone, brains already tuned to patterns in the landscape, learning that a certain kind of mound, in a certain soil, near certain trees, reliably contains food. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that kind of knowledge becomes embedded. Grandmothers pointing with their chins toward a particular hill. Children taught which mounds are alive and which are abandoned. Young foragers learning how to time their visits to termite swarms after the first heavy rains. These aren't dramatic hunting stories, they're quiet habits, which is exactly why they can be so evolutionarily powerful. Alongside termites and other social insects, there was another sweeter prize: honey. Humans are unusual primates in many ways, but one of our more charming quirks is our almost universal love of sweetness. In wild landscapes, intense sweetness is rare. You might get it in bursts from very ripe fruit, but nothing quite matches the concentrated sugar of honey. For groups like the Hadza, honey isn't just a treat. It's one of the most highly valued foods in the entire diet. Hadza men will climb precarious trees, smoke out angry bees, and endure dozens of stings to reach a hive. The reward isn't just the golden liquid. It's the honeycomb itself, wax, bee larvae, stored pollen. A mixture of simple sugars, fats, proteins, and micronutrients that can deliver a dense caloric payload to a hungry body. We have good reasons to think this pattern goes back a long way. Some rock art from Africa and Europe, tens of thousands of years old, appears to show figures climbing ropes or vines toward what look like bee nests, surrounded by swarms of dots that may represent bees. It's not proof in the mathematical sense, but it fits neatly with what we see in present-day foragers, and with the simple fact that honey is one of the most calorie-dense wild foods available. For an ancestor living on the edge of energy balance, walking long distances, nursing children, healing from injuries, a seasonal infusion of honey and larvae would have been a gift. Then there are the grubs, larvae and pupae hiding in dead wood, under bark, in the roots of plants, or in the guts of fallen palms. Soft-bodied, slow, relatively defenseless. You don't need complex tools or coordinated group strategies to catch them. You need curiosity, patience, and maybe a digging stick. For young children, elders, or anyone without the strength to join a high-risk hunt, these fat-rich mouthfuls could provide essential calories with minimal danger. In many hunter-gatherer societies, we see a pattern of broad-spectrum foraging by those less able to chase big game. Small animals, shellfish, seeds, and yes, insects and grubs. Taken together, these foods form a quiet safety net under the more glamorous calories of large prey. When anthropologists reconstruct the likely diets of our Stone Age ancestors, insects almost always appear in the background as part of that net. Not the star of the meal, but the thing that meant the difference between hungry and weak, between losing weight fast and holding steady when a hunt failed or plants were out of season. Given all this, it raises an obvious question. If insects are reliable, nutrient-dense, and historically familiar, why do so many of us now find them unthinkable as food? Part of the answer is simple. Abundance changes taste. With the rise of agriculture, especially in the last 10,000 years, human communities in many regions began to produce large surpluses of plant calories, grains, pulses, later potatoes and maize. Domesticated animals converted some of that into predictable meat, milk and fat. In societies built on cereal fields and livestock herds, the daily risk of severe calorie shortfall dropped. Food became more storable, more uniform, more processed. Against this backdrop, insect eating started to look unnecessary. And what is unnecessary in a culture that has the luxury of choice is often rebranded as undesirable. Religions and social norms layered on top of that economic shift. In some traditions, insects were lumped in with unclean creatures, associated with decay, filth, or punishment. In others, they simply fell out of the canon of respectable foods, sidelined by bread, beef, and wine. Meanwhile, in places where agriculture was less dominant or ecosystems made crop surpluses harder to maintain, insects remained on the menu. Southeast Asia, parts of Africa, Latin America, in many of these regions, markets still sell fried crickets, roasted caterpillars, and seasoned ant eggs as ordinary foods. The Westerner version isn't universal. It's historical and cultural, the product of a few centuries of abundance and a particular set of values about what proper food looks like. But our bodies don't share those values. From a purely biological perspective, the Stone Age logic still holds. Insects, larvae, honey and grubs are nutrient-dense, often safer than large carcasses that can rot or harbour parasites, and generally less risky to obtain than charging a wounded buffalo. They're part of the forgotten protein landscape that shaped our teeth, our guts, and our expectations of what a landscape can offer. When we remember that, a strange thing happens. The idea of a hunter returning empty-handed from the plains feels less absolute. Behind him, in the shade of trees and in the cracks of old logs, children and elders might be prying out beetle larvae, cracking termite mounds, following honey guides to hidden hives. The drama of the big hunt is still there, but beneath it runs a quieter, humbler current of crawling, buzzing life. That hidden layer of protein and fat helped buffer our ancestors against the chaos of climate and the whims of large prey. And it sets the stage for the next step in our culinary evolution. Not just finding food where it already exists, but transforming it, storing it, and bending time itself so that abundance in one season could feed hungry mouths in another. If insects and honey were ways of finding hidden calories in the present, fermentation and storage were ways of smuggling calories into the future. They were, in a very literal sense, time-bending technologies, and like many important inventions in human history, they probably began as accidents. Imagine a shallow pit near a camp lined with leaves. People throw things into it, leftover tubers, some chewed but not finished fibrous roots, maybe scraps of fruit. It's shaded, slightly damp, and not too far from where people relieve themselves. In modern terms, we'd call that a fermentation starter. Microbes from soil, skin, and guts drift in. Find this mix of carbohydrates and moisture and begin to feed. They break down tough plant fibers, produce acids and gases, and change both the texture and the flavour of what's in the pit. If you came back a few days or weeks later and tasted it, one of two things would happen. Sometimes it would be rotten in the way we mean when we say don't eat that. Slimy, foul, clearly dangerous. But sometimes it would be sour, fizzy, softer, and oddly pleasant. Easier to chew, easier to digest. The sort of thing you might eat when you were hungry enough. Then notice, afterwards, that your belly felt strangely comfortable instead of bloated and aching. Over years and generations, those lucky accidents start to look less like accidents and more like traditions. Ethnographers working with modern hunter-gatherers and small-scale horticulturalists have documented an astonishing variety of fermented foods produced with minimal equipment. Roots buried in the ground to soften, seeds soaked and left to sour, fish and meat aged in pits or under stones, honey diluted with water and left until it begins to fizz. It's unlikely that formal fermentation, in the way we now think of cheese or wine, sprang fully formed 50,000 years ago, but the basic principle, let microbes do some of the digestion for you, is so simple and the conditions so common that many researchers suspect our ancestors were harnessing it long before agriculture. When you look at what fermentation does, you can see why. It preserves. By turning sugars into acids or alcohol, it makes food less hospitable to dangerous bacteria. It unlocks nutrients. Sour fermentation can reduce anti-nutrients in plants, make minerals more available, and partially break down complex carbohydrates. And it creates new chemicals that interact directly with our brains. Modern studies on fermented foods and the microbiome are still in their early days, but a general picture is emerging. Regular intake of live, microbially rich foods can influence gut bacteria in ways that, in turn, affect mood, stress responses, and even cognition. You don't need a Stone Age randomized controlled trial to see how this might have played out in the past. Groups that stumbled into routines of eating slightly fermented fruits roots, or meats. The stuff in the shady pit, the seeds that accidentally soaked, the scrap of meat left near a cool spring, would have been regularly seeding their guts with wild bacteria and yeasts. Those microbes would help break down tough fibers, produce vitamins, and compete with more dangerous pathogens. Over time, this would shape not just digestion, but the entire gut ecosystem. And because the gut and brain are wired together with a dense web of nerves, hormones, and immune signals, that shift in the internal ecosystem could subtly change how people felt and functioned. Perhaps there were bands who, without knowing why, had slightly calmer children, slightly more resilient adults, slightly fewer infections after bad food. Those small differences, stretched out over thousands of years, can turn into big evolutionary nudges. Fermentation may have been one of the quiet, invisible forces training our bodies and brains to live in deep cooperation with microbes. But fermentation is only half the story. The other half is storage. If you look at the Stone Age through the lens of food, it's a long negotiation with seasonality. Animals migrate. Fruits ripen for a week and disappear. Seeds harden and become inedible unless you know what to do with them. Rains come and go. Any group that wanted to sit in one place for more than a fleeting season needed ways to stretch abundance into scarcity. Archaeologists find hints of this in places that, at first glance, don't look like much. Dark stains in the earth, clusters of stones, odd patterns of bones and shells. At sites in the Levant and Europe dating back tens of thousands of years, there are pits that don't match the profile of simple trash dumps. Their walls are deliberately lined with stone or packed clay. Some contain layers of burned earth and ash suggesting repeated use. Others are capped, then reopened. These look a lot like early storage features, underground containers for food. In cooler climates, meat could be kept in permafrost cracks or deep caves, where year-round cold acted as natural refrigerator. In drier regions, slabs of meat could be sliced thin and laid on rocks or racks to dry in the sun and wind, sometimes with smoke from low fires drifting over them. Drying and smoking don't leave neat, fossilized labels. They leave indirect evidence, cut marks on bones that suggest precise defleshing, concentrations of small bones where meat has been stripped and removed, hearths that burned for long periods without the sort of intense heat you'd need for cooking every meal. Some coastal sites show layers of fish bones and shells far beyond what day-to-day eating would produce, as if people were processing bulk catches, not just occasional meals. It's easy to imagine strings of fish hung over racks, smoke curling around them, slowly turning fresh flesh into something tough, salty, and long-lasting. Storage pits, drying racks, cached bones. Together they form what you could call the first pantries. Not buildings with shelves, but structured spaces in the landscape where food could wait. And waiting is the key word. Once you start storing food, you are planning for a self that does not yet exist. The person who will stand here weeks or months from now, hungry, grateful that you took the time to bury those nuts, dry that meat, or stash those roots in a cool cave. That kind of forward-looking behavior doesn't appear out of nowhere. It rests on a base of social trust. If it takes days to dig and line a pit, to fill it with surplus food you could eat right now, you're making a bet that you or your kin will be the ones to open it later, and that others will respect that. Anthropologists working with modern foragers often see unwritten rules around caches and shared stores. Some things are free for all. Some belong clearly to individuals or families. Some are shared ceremonially. As soon as surplus enters the picture, so do questions of ownership, obligation, and power. Preservation starts to reshape social life. If your band knows how to smoke meat and hide it in a distant cave, you can range farther from waterholes, confident that you have backup supplies. If you can bury acorns or wild grains and come back to them months later, you can survive lean seasons that might kill a neighbouring group without those skills. Stored food becomes a kind of wealth. Not the gleaming, visible wealth of later kings and temples, but quiet wealth. Calories waiting under the ground along a familiar river bank, in a hollow tree known only to your relatives. That wealth can be traded. Archaeological sites from the late Stone Age show obsidian, shells and pigments moving across landscapes far beyond walking distance. People weren't dragging giant stones purely for fun. They were plugging into networks of exchange. If you have extra dried fish from a seasonal run and another group inland has more nuts or roots than they can immediately eat, a simple logic emerges. We'll meet at the same place next year, bring what we have too much of, and leave with what we lack. Food preservation makes delayed reciprocity possible. You can promise to repay a favour in the next season's salmon run, or when the termites swarm, because you know you'll have more than you can eat that week, and the tools to make it last. Somewhere in this web of burying, smoking, drying and sharing, another kind of fermentation may have slipped in, the fizzy, head-swimming kind. There is a long-running debate among archaeologists about when humans first began deliberately brewing alcohol. The safe statement is that clear, unambiguous evidence comes with settled villages and agriculture. But the ingredients for accidental alcohol are simple: sugar, water, wild yeast and thyme. Ripe fruit that falls and collects in a hollow rain-filled tree trunk can ferment all by itself. Honey diluted with water and left in a skin bag can turn into a rough mead. Starchy roots or grains that begin to sprout, then sit in warm water, will yield a sweet liquid that microbes happily convert to alcohol. Primates, including chimpanzees, have been observed seeking out naturally fermented fruit. Some human groups today produce mildly alcoholic drinks from wild plants with minimal equipment, suggesting that the conceptual leap is small. At some point, maybe tens of thousands of years ago, our ancestors weren't just bumping into drunken fruit by accident. They were learning that if you leave this mixture alone for a while, it changes in predictable ways. Alcohol in small doses is a social drug. It alters mood, loosens conversation, blurs edges. In a world where group cohesion could mean life or death, a shared mildly intoxicating drink might have become part of ritual, bonding, or storytelling. And of course, like other fermented foods, early brews would have carried microbial passengers, adding yet another layer of influence on the gut and brain. Put all of this together, the sour pits, the smoked racks, the buried caches, the first experimental brews, and you can see the faint outline of a future that hasn't quite arrived yet. A future in which humans don't just follow food, but begin to command it. Fermentation and storage are small acts of control over nature's timing. Once you've learned that you can coax microbes to work for you, that you can bend seasonal abundance into something like stability, the next questions come almost automatically. If I can keep these roots from spoiling, could I make sure there are more of them next year growing closer to camp? If I can gather and dry all this grain, what happens if I deliberately scatter some of it in a clearing? If I can rely on my pit of acorns to get my children through the winter, what would it take to have not just enough, but extra, enough to trade, to give away, to build obligations that stretch into the future? The proto-pantry, those first pits, racks and caves, isn't agriculture. The plants and animals are still wild, the landscape still mostly untamed, but the mental shift has started. Food is no longer just something that appears and disappears out there, beyond human control. It's something you can slowly, experimentally, begin to shape. And as we'll see, once humans took that step, once they began to lean harder and harder on storage, surplus and control, the rhythm of feasts and famines that had pulsed through our species for millions of years started to change. For most of our species' history, the idea of breakfast, lunch, and dinner would have sounded like a strange joke. Food did not arrive by clock. It arrived by chance, by weather, by migration routes, by whether the berries came in late this year or the antelope herd shifted its path 10 miles to the east. Your ancestors ate when they could, what they could, as much as they could safely carry in their stomachs and sometimes a bit more. Then they stopped, not because the clock said so, but because there was nothing left within reach that was worth the effort or the risk. The rhythm of their eating was written in the landscape, not in routine. In many environments, that rhythm took the shape of a long, slow wave, months of relative scarcity, then a burst of abundance so extreme it was almost absurd. Imagine a dry savanna at the end of the lean season. The grasses are brittle, roots are small and woody, the animals are thin and wary, people are lean too, not necessarily on the brink of death, but always slightly hungry, always calculating. Every decision has a caloric cost. Walk to that distant waterhole and maybe find something, or stay here and conserve energy. Try to dig for those deep tubers you found last year, or accept that the soil is too hard and your hands already ache. Then the rains arrive. The change is not polite. It can be violent. Thunder, sheets of water, sudden floods. Within a week or two, the world changes colour. Shoots push through the soil. Flowers appear. Insects swarm. The air hums. Animals respond first. Ungulates that have been clustered around the last shrinking water sources begin to move, tracking the green. Birds follow. Predators follow the herbivores, and humans follow everything. This is the time of plenty that older people in the band have been talking about since the start of the dry season. The time when the fruits swell and split, when fish run, when certain trees drop protein-rich seeds in such numbers that the ground looks carpeted. In those weeks, the logic of eating flips. The problem is no longer how do we find enough, but how do we handle all of this before it disappears? On days when a large animal goes down or a salmon run hits its peak or a patch of wild grains ripens all at once, the only rational response is to gorge. Modern hunter-gatherers do this routinely. Ethnographers tell stories of people eating several thousand calories in a single sitting after a successful hunt, then moving slowly, contentedly for hours, laughing about their swollen bellies. Your Stone Age ancestors did the same. They weren't gluttons in the moral sense. They were specialists in energy storage. Their bodies had been shaped over millions of years by a world where tomorrow might bring another feast, or 3 days of empty searching. So when calories appeared, their physiology treated it like a command. Eat, fill the liver with glycogen, pack the muscles with fuel, turn the overflow into fat and tuck it away under the skin, around the organs, in every safe corner. Fat was not an aesthetic problem. It was a survival account. Gorging in times of plenty, far from being a bad habit, was a biological investment strategy. And just as important was the other side of the curve, the steady, familiar descent into less. As the season turned again, as fruits vanished, as the herds moved away or the rivers shrank, meals changed character. They became smaller, more monotonous. A few roots dug with increasing effort. Tough leaves, small animals, scraps of stored meat or nuts carefully rationed. Sometimes there were 1 or 2 substantial meals in a day. Sometimes there was only one. Sometimes there was a day with nothing at all. In that world, intermittent fasting was not a wellness trend. It was the backdrop of existence. From the perspective of your cells, this stop-and-start, feast-and-famine pattern was normal. During the feast, glucose from carbohydrates surged into the bloodstream. Insulin rose, shepherding that sugar into cells, restocking short-term reserves and building long-term fat stores. As hours passed and no new food arrived, blood sugar slowly fell. the body switched fuels. First it burned through the glycogen in the liver. Then, as that tank drained, hormones nudged fat cells to open and release their cargo. Fatty acids and ketone bodies, molecules that can feed muscles, organs, and when necessary, the brain itself. Modern biologists call this metabolic flexibility, the ability to move smoothly between burning sugars and burning fats, between fed and fasted states. In the Stone Age, that flexibility wasn't an optional fitness metric. It was a prerequisite for being alive at all. Children who could tolerate longer gaps between meals without becoming weak, unfocused, or dangerously hypoglycemic had better odds of surviving hard seasons. Adults whose bodies could down-regulate energy use, tapping fat reserves while maintaining enough clarity to track animals or dig roots, were more likely to keep their offspring alive. Over very long stretches of time, those tiny advantages add up. Genes that supported flexible fuel use, efficient fat storage in the right places, and the ability to stay mentally sharp in a fasted state would have been gently, persistently favoured. You carry some of these genes. They are the reason you can go to sleep, not eat for 8 or 10 hours, and still wake up capable of standing, thinking, and walking. They are also the reason that, when you sit down in front of a pile of calorie-dense food, some deep part of your physiology still whispers, "Take more, this might not last." In the middle of this harsh rhythm, there were bright spikes of something else. Social feasts. When a really big animal fell, something that could not possibly be eaten or processed by a single small band before it spoiled, news travelled. Smoke on the horizon. Shouted calls. Runners dispatched along familiar paths. Neighbouring groups arrived, not just for the meat, but for the gathering itself. There would be work first. Skinning, butchering, sorting fat from lean cuts, deciding which pieces would be roasted immediately and which would be dried or smoked. Then, as the sun lowered and the first pieces of meat crisped over coals, as marrow was sucked from bones and shared, something else happened. Stories. Old hunts retold. Dangers catalogued. Gossip exchanged. Marriages arranged. Objects traded. Seasonal plant bonanzas played a similar role. When a certain tree dropped its oily nuts, or a valley flushed with ripe fruit, or an insect swarm became so dense that children could fill baskets with a few sweeps of their hands, people didn't just gather food, they gathered each other. In those feasts, calories were converted into more than body fat. They were converted into memory, obligation, affection, and knowledge. Who helped in the butchery? Who shared their last piece of dried meat in the previous lean season and now received the best cut in return? Who knew the path to the hidden spring or the timing of the next fish run? The feast-famine rhythm was biological, but it was also social. Abundance wasn't only stored in bellies and in hidden caches, it was stored in relationships. If you look at modern human bodies in light of this ancient pattern, some puzzles begin to make sense. Our hormones that regulate hunger and satiety, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, are exquisitely tuned to short-term fluctuations, but they are not very good at dealing with permanent abundance. Our fat cells are eager to receive and reluctant to let go, because for most of history a generous fat reserve was insurance, not liability. Our brains react to sugar and fat with powerful reward signals, because in the past those were rare jackpots scattered through a sea of low-calorie fibre and lean protein. What we have now in many places is not just more food, it is a broken rhythm. The scarcity part of the cycle has been, for many people, almost entirely removed. The feast never ends. The famine never arrives. We still carry bodies that expect long walks before and after big meals, that anticipate days of light eating after a week of heavy abundance, that are comfortable sliding into mild ketosis overnight or during a hungry afternoon. When that slide never comes, when we graze from waking to sleep, or eat highly processed foods that keep blood sugar elevated and insulin constantly at work, those old metabolic programs can start to misfire. Some researchers think this mismatch helps explain why conditions like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver disease are so common in modern societies with stable food supplies. Our biology isn't bad, it's simply calibrated for a world where a festival of meat and honey would be followed, inevitably by a long return to roots, leaves, insects, and, on some days, water alone. Remembering that older pattern isn't about romanticizing hardship or prescribing a single, natural way to eat now. It's about understanding that every cell in your body is descended from a lineage that learned to dance to a very specific tune. Now there is food. Now there is less. Now there is almost none. Now, suddenly, there is plenty again. In the next part of this story, we'll follow that tune into the skeleton itself and see what this ancient rhythm of scarcity and abundance carved into bones, teeth, and the quiet record of health left behind in the earth. If you want to know what that rhythm of feast and famine really did to your ancestors, you don't start with recipes, you start with bones. Archaeologists sometimes call skeletons the archive of the flesh. Long after skin has rotted away and soft organs have vanished without a trace, bone keeps quiet notes. Every stress, every long illness, every period of malnutrition leaves some kind of signature. Not always dramatic, sometimes just a slight thinning here, a faint line there, a tiny porous patch at the eye socket. Taken one by one, these details are easy to miss. Taken across hundreds of skeletons, across thousands of years, they begin to sound like a story. In many late Stone Age sites, that story is unexpectedly consistent. You see people whose bodies were used hard, joints worn, spines compressed, muscle attachments thick and powerful, but who show surprisingly few of the chronic diseases that define modern life. Their skeletons are not perfect, far from it, but they carry a different pattern of damage. One of the clearest windows into this difference sits right at the entrance to the body, the teeth. If you picture Stone Age mouths as rows of broken, blackened stumps, the archaeological record has a gentle correction to offer. In many pre-agricultural populations, cavities are rare. Gum disease tends to be mild. Tooth loss in middle adulthood is much less common than in later farming communities. The paradox is striking. These people didn't have toothbrushes, no floss, no fluoride. They chewed on sticks sometimes, and maybe rubbed abrasive plants against their teeth, but nothing like modern dental care. And yet, compared with the first generations of farmers, they often had better dental health. Part of the reason lies in what they were not eating. Refined sugars and finely milled starches, the things that bacteria adore, the things that stick in the cracks and feed plaque, simply did not exist. Their carbohydrates arrived wrapped in fibre, roots that had to be chewed, wild fruits with tough skins, seeds and nuts ground on stone but rarely to the talcum-fine consistency of modern flour. Food cleared more quickly from the teeth. Blood sugar surged less abruptly. The bacteria that cause cavities had a harder time finding a permanent foothold. When agriculture arrived, and with it diets heavy in soft, sticky grains, all of that changed. In skeletons from early farming villages, you see a dramatic jump in cavity rates, abscesses, and tooth loss. In the hunter-gatherers who came before, dental problems certainly existed. There are cracked molars, broken incisors, infections that went bad. But as a population pattern, mouths were often cleaner than those of their village-dwelling descendants. Below the jawline, another contrast appears. Stone Age bones are quite literally denser. When you hold a well-preserved femur from a pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer and compare it to one from a later sedentary farmer, the difference is almost tactile. Thicker cortical bone, more robust muscle attachments, a kind of structural confidence that comes from a lifetime of carrying your own body weight, and often much more, over long distances. These were people for whom movement was not optional. Walking, running, climbing, squatting, lifting, digging. The daily load on their skeletons was enormous. In response, their bones adapted. Bone is not a static material. It is constantly being broken down and rebuilt. Strain and impact are signals. Make this part stronger. Reinforce this bridge. In many hunter-gatherer populations, especially those living in rugged terrain, the result is a skeleton that would, by modern standards, qualify as heavily trained. This doesn't mean they were invulnerable. There are plenty of healed fractures, crushed vertebrae, and misaligned joints in the record, reminders of falls, accidents, and violence. But conditions like severe osteoporosis, bones so thin that simple falls shatter hips and wrists, seem to have been much less common before long-term sedentary life became the norm. Even their height holds clues. If you trace average stature through time, using long bones as a guide, a pattern emerges. In many regions, late Stone Age hunter-gatherers reach impressive heights. Men and women as tall, or almost as tall, as people in the best-nourished modern societies. Then, with the dawn of agriculture, average stature often drops, not a little, sometimes by several centimetres in just a few thousand years. This doesn't mean farmers were genetically shorter. It suggests that, on average, their growing bodies were not getting as high-quality nutrition or as consistent access to protein and micronutrients as their foraging ancestors. Children born into early farming communities might have had enough calories. Bulk grain porridge can fill a belly, but not enough diversity, less meat and fish, fewer wild greens, more reliance on a single staple crop that could fail, rot, or be contaminated. When stress and infection layered on top of that, growth faltered. Scattered among the tall and the shorter are even finer marks of scarcity. On the surface of children's teeth, pale horizontal lines sometimes appear like faint tree rings. These are enamel hyperplasias, scars left when growth briefly stopped or slowed because of illness or malnutrition. In long bones, you occasionally see similar interruptions, dense lines that mark a pause in growth, a crisis survived. In the bones around the eyes and inside the skull, porous sponge-like changes can signal chronic anemia, often linked to iron deficiency or long-term infection. Taken together, these signs tell us that Stone Age life, even before agriculture, was not a golden age of effortless health. There were lean seasons that bit into children's growth. There were years when meat was scarce, when roots failed, when infection and hunger conspired. But in many hunter-gatherer groups, these episodes seem to have been intermittent, not permanent. Bodies rebounded. Teeth with enamel scars still belong to adults whose later bones look strong and fully grown, as if hard years in childhood were followed by better ones. The skeletons also record what that foraging life did to joints. Knees, hips, and lower backs from late Stone Age adults often show osteoarthritis, the gradual wearing down of cartilage, and the formation of extra bone at joints. This is not the inflammatory arthritis of an overactive immune system. It is the straightforward, mechanical kind that comes from a lifetime of use. Grinding grains on stone hour after hour, year after year, leaves a characteristic pattern in wrists, elbows, and shoulders. Certain finger joints become enlarged and roughened. Digging sticks and carrying loads on the head or back reshape vertebrae, creating compressed discs and bony spurs. In coastal groups, repeated paddling and hauling nets leave their own signature in the shoulders. In high-latitude groups, endless scraping of hides and twisting of fibres does the same for hands. To modern eyes, these changes can look alarming. But many individuals with severe joint wear show no signs of catastrophic disability. Their bones attest continued use. Remodeled areas, new muscle attachments, healed microfractures. They kept moving, adapting to pain, changing how they worked. In some ways, the picture resembles that of modern manual labourers and lifelong athletes, bodies marked by their occupations, but still fundamentally strong. Amid all of this, a final, often misunderstood question hovers. How long did they live? You will sometimes hear that ancient humans usually died by 30, as if every adult was swept away at the age when many modern people are just settling into careers. The skeletons tell a more nuanced story. When you look at life expectancy at birth, an average that includes every infant who dies in the first days and weeks of life, Stone Age numbers are indeed low. High infant mortality drags the average down dramatically. But if you calculate life expectancy for those who survive childhood, a different picture appears. In many foraging populations, someone who reached 15 or 20 had a good chance of living into their 50s or 60s, sometimes beyond. Archaeological sites contain plenty of older adults, skulls with heavily worn teeth, vertebrae with fused joints, long bones with thin, remodelled ends. These elders would have looked old by any standard. They would have walked more slowly, perhaps leaned on sticks, perhaps carried a lifetime of scars, but they were there, long enough to share hunting knowledge, plant lore, seasonal memory, long enough to help with grandchildren, long enough to carry stories of drought years and fat years across decades. So when you imagine your Stone Age ancestors, it may be more accurate to picture a small band that includes not only hunters in their prime and children darting underfoot, but also grey-haired women and men, their skeletons already etched with the record of long lives. All of them built from the same basic ingredients: meat, plants, insects, fish, roots, nuts, seeds. All of them shaped by the same alternating pulses of plenty and want. Their bones, teeth and joints show that this way of eating and moving produced bodies that were strong, adaptable and resilient, but also vulnerable in familiar human ways, to infection, to injury, to bad seasons. Inside those bones, another story was unfolding too, a quieter story, invisible to the naked eye. In the next part, we'll travel down into that hidden world, into the twisting tunnels of the gut, and the invisible multitudes that once fed on the same ancient diets your ancestors did. If bones are the archive of the flesh, the gut is the archive of the meal. It doesn't fossilize in the same satisfying way. Intestines vanish. Stomach linings dissolve. The living, shifting communities of microbes that once filled those dark spaces disappear within hours of death. And yet traces remain. Sometimes, in dry caves or desert rock shelters, people left behind something most archaeologists are strangely delighted to find: fossilized poop. The technical term is coprolite, but at its heart, it is exactly what it sounds like: a moment of digestion, frozen in time. Under a microscope, coprolites become tiny time capsules. You see pollen grains from plants long vanished from the local landscape, bits of crushed bone and shell, fragments of insect wings, starch granules from roots and seeds, parasite eggs, and with modern techniques, you can sometimes recover fragments of DNA from the bacteria that once lived in those ancient guts. The picture that is emerging from these unlikely fossils and from hardened plaque on Stone Age teeth, the yellowish crust dentis, now called dental calculus, is surprisingly consistent. Your ancestors carried around a microbial world that was richer, more varied, and probably more dynamic than the one most people host today. Dental calculus is especially revealing. For tens of thousands of years, every meal left a microscopic film on the teeth, bits of food, stray bacteria, tiny proteins from saliva and blood. In life, some of that would have been scrubbed away by chewing tough food or rubbing with sticks, but a thin layer stayed. It hardened. Then more layers built up over it, like lime in an old kettle. Within those layers, scientists have found DNA and proteins from hundreds of bacterial species. Some of them are familiar, cousins of the mouth bacteria we still carry. Others are strangers, ancient lineages that seem to have dropped out of modern Western mouths entirely. The same pattern appears in the few ancient gut samples we can study. Compared to the intestines of many people living in industrialized societies today, the guts of past humans and of modern hunter-gatherers who still follow traditional diets look like lush rainforests. Ours often look more like careful. They never make it to the bacterial metropolis of the colon. What does arrive, especially in people eating plant-heavy Stone Age diets, is everything your own enzymes couldn't digest. Long, tangled carbohydrates from roots and tubers, tough plant cell walls, resistant starch from cooled cooked foods, tiny bits of gristle and connective tissue. To you, these are leftovers. To your microbes, they are dinner. Bacteria in the colon feast on these fibers, fermenting them into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, acetate, and propionate. These molecules might sound obscure, but they are central to the quiet truce between you and your microbiome. They feed the cells lining your colon, helping to keep the gut barrier strong and less leaky. They influence blood sugar regulation. They talk to immune cells, nudging them towards calm vigilance instead of constant alarm. A Stone Age person chewing through a day's worth of roots, nuts, seeds, fruits, leafy greens, and occasional unrefined grains would have been providing a constant trickle of this microbial fuel. Their guts would have been noisy with fermentation, not just from obvious ferments like rotting meat caches or soured plant mash, but from the ongoing internal fermentation of fibers the human body can't handle alone. When scientists went looking for a modern window into this kind of internal ecosystem, one group kept coming up in the literature, the Hadza of Tanzania. The Hadza are one of the few remaining peoples who still live largely by hunting and gathering. Their diet is not a museum piece. It shifts with the seasons, with politics, with the encroachment of roads and markets, but it still contains a mix of wild tubers, berries, baobab fruit, honey, and hunted meat that probably echoes many patterns of the late Stone Age. When researchers sampled Hadza gut bacteria, they found something striking. Hadza guts host bacterial groups that are extremely rare or absent in industrialized populations. They also show pronounced seasonal shifts. In the dry season, when meat and tubers dominate, certain species flourish. In the wet season, when berries and honey become abundant, the community changes. It is as if the internal ecosystem breathes with the landscape, expanding one group then another as different foods arrive. Some of the Hadza-associated bacteria are especially good at breaking down complex fibers. Others may help keep inflammation in check. Similar patterns appear in other traditional groups. Higher diversity, more fiber-eating specialists, more microbial skills that seem tuned to handling a wide variety of wild foods. This doesn't mean the Hadza or any present-day community is a perfect snapshot of your ancestors. Their history is their own. Their landscape, diseases and challenges are unique, but they offer a living hint of how flexible and responsive the human microbiome can be when it is continually fed with unprocessed, varied seasonal foods. This microbial flexibility matters for more than digestion. Your immune system grew up negotiating with your microbes. From the moment a Stone Age baby was born, likely covered in its mother's vaginal and skin bacteria, laid against a chest that had never seen antibacterial soap, its immune cells began sorting friend from foe. Breast milk carried not just nutrients, but special sugars indigestible to the infant and perfectly suited to certain beneficial bacteria. Dirt on the ground, fur on animal skins, insect parts in food, harmless worms in the soil, all of it contributed to a constant stream of information. For the developing immune system, this was a training camp. Cells learned not to overreact to harmless pollen and food proteins. They learnt to tolerate the microbes that helped digest fiber and produce vitamins. They learned to respond forcefully when true pathogens appeared. In modern environments, many of those signals have been turned down. Clean water, sewage systems, and antibiotics have saved countless lives. Child mortality has plummeted. Diseases that once ravaged villages now rarely appear. But along the way, the old curriculum of immune education has changed. This is the essence of what scientists call the hygiene hypothesis, though newer versions use gentler names like the old friends hypothesis. The idea is not that dirt is good and soap is bad. It is that humans evolved with a particular set of microbial companions, gut bacteria, skin organisms, mild environmental parasites, and our immune systems came to rely on their presence to calibrate themselves. When those old friends disappear, the immune system can lose some of its nuance. It may start treating cat dander or peanut proteins as if they are deadly infections. It may slip into chronic low-grade inflammation, contributing to diseases that were far rarer in the Stone Age. Certain allergies, autoimmune conditions, perhaps some forms of asthma, and inflammatory bowel disease. Your ancestors were not healthier in any simple romantic sense. They faced parasites, infections, and wounds that could kill in days. But they probably didn't spend decades in a subtle war with their own immune systems, triggered by mismatches between ancient biology and modern environments. When you put all these strands together, the coprolites, the dental calculus, the Hadza data, the immune theories, a picture begins to form. It suggests that Stone Age eating wasn't just about calories and protein. It was about maintaining a thriving, adaptable internal ecosystem that helped digest tough foods, produced crucial byproducts, and kept the immune system well trained. So what does that mean for you, lying in a world of packaged snacks and sterile countertops? It doesn't mean you should try to recreate a Paleolithic menu in perfect detail. That world is gone. Its plants, animals, parasites, and dangers are not coming back. But modern science does hint at a few ancient patterns worth reconsidering. More unrefined plant foods, rich in the kinds of fibers that make it all the way to your colon. More variety across seasons if possible. Different fruits, roots, leaves, and grains, instead of the same few staples every day. Fermented foods made with live cultures, yogurt, kefir, kimchi, pickles that actually ferment, as a nod toward the ever-present microbes of the past. Less reliance on highly processed, low-fiber, high-sugar foods that starve your internal rainforests and favor just a few fast-growing bacterial species. And when safe and appropriate, a bit more contact with the non-sterile world. Soil on garden vegetables, time outdoors, encounters with plants and animals that remind your immune system of its long history. None of this will turn a modern gut into a Stone Age one, but it gestures in the same direction, towards diversity, resilience, and a relationship with microbes that is more partnership than battlefield. Your ancestors walked through a world alive with bacteria, fungi, and tiny invertebrates. They breathed them, ate them, shared them with each other and with the animals they hunted. Those invisible companions shaped their digestion, their immunity, and in quiet ways, their survival. In the next part of this story, we'll watch what happened when humans changed that relationship in the most dramatic way of all. Not by shifting microbes, but by reshaping the entire menu. Fields would replace forests, grain would replace tubers, villages would replace wandering bands, and the human body, inside and out, would have to learn all over again how to live with its food. The first wheat field didn't look like a field. It looked like a patch of stubborn grass near a seasonal stream, thin stalks, small seeds, nothing you or your ancestors would have glanced at twice. For hundreds of thousands of years, those seeds were just one more thing to gather here and there, a side dish, a snack, a bit of insurance when hunting was bad and roots ran low. Then, in a few corners of the world, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, something shifted. In the hills of the Fertile Crescent, people who had been foraging wild wheat and barley for generations started doing something quietly radical. They returned to the same patches again and again. They weeded out competing plants without calling it weeding. They dropped seeds near camp without calling it planting. In the Yellow River valleys of China, others did the same with a different grass, millet. In the damp lowlands of what is now Mexico, wild teosinte, a scraggly plant with hard little kernels, began, under human attention, to slowly swell into something we would recognize as maize. In the highlands of New Guinea, along the Nile, in West Africa, in the Andes, in parts of India and Southeast Asia, similar stories unfolded with taro, yams, sorghum, rice, potatoes. Not once, but many times, in many places, people began nudging plants and landscapes in a particular direction. They were not reading agricultural manuals. They were not holding village meetings about transitioning to a farming economy. They were simply noticing. Seeds sprouted where cooking waste had been thrown. Grasses grew thicker where soil had been disturbed. Certain plants did better when their rivals were pulled up or burned away. Over generations, almost accidentally at first, your ancestors took a step that no other primate had ever taken at scale. They began to depend not on what was simply there, but on what they could coax from the earth. From the perspective of a single lifetime, the change was slow. A few more seed-rich patches, a bit more time spent tending near camp, a bit less time roaming widely. From the perspective of deep time, it was a revolution. For most of the Stone Age, a human diet had been a shifting, opportunistic mosaic. Meat and marrow when hunting went well, shellfish and fish along coasts, tubers and roots, nuts and seeds, fruits in season, leafy greens, insects, small animals, honey, whatever each landscape offered. No single plant, no single animal dominated the menu for long. Agriculture tilted that balance. Instead of dozens or hundreds of wild plant species, many communities began to rely on a narrow handful of domesticated crops. Wheat and barley in Southwest Asia, rice in East and parts of South Asia, maize in the Americas, sorghum and millet in Africa. Around them, second waves of domesticates gathered. Peas, lentils, beans, chickpeas, later soybeans and other legumes. Fruit trees slowly entered the picture. Variety didn't vanish overnight. Farmers still gathered wild greens, hunted, fished, dug roots. But more and more of their calories came from these few carefully tended species. On the surface, this looked like progress. Grain could be stored. A good harvest meant security through a bad winter. Fields near the village meant elders and children didn't have to wander far for food. More mouths could be fed in a smaller area. Yet when you look at the bodies of the first farmers, a different story begins to whisper from the bones. Archaeologists can sometimes line up skeletons from the same region before and after the agricultural shift. The patterns are unsettling. Hunter-gatherer skeletons on average are taller, with thicker bones and broader joints. Their teeth often show wear from grit and tough foods, but relatively few cavities. Signs of childhood malnutrition, lines in teeth, stunted long bones, are present but not dominant. Then, as farming takes hold, things change. Average stature drops, sometimes by several centimetres in just a few thousand years. Bones become more gracile, but also show signs of stress. Thicker areas where muscles strained against monotonous, repetitive labour. Dental health declines sharply. Caries, cavities, become common, especially in grain-based societies. Sticky, carbohydrate-rich porridges and breads leave sugar on the teeth. Oral bacteria metabolize it, producing acids that slowly drill into enamel. Dental abscesses appear in jaws. Worn teeth are not new, rotten teeth in large numbers are. There are also more skeletal markers of anemia and vitamin deficiencies. Porous areas in skull bones and eye sockets hint at iron-poor diets or chronic infections. Episodes of growth arrest in children's bones suggest periods when food was short or illness was common. Taken together, the early chapters of farming look, from the inside out, less like a triumph and more like a trade. More people, but on average, smaller, sicker people. And that was only the beginning of what agriculture changed. When you plant fields, you stop moving as much. Villages grow around the croplands. Storage pits and granaries anchor people in place. Over time, temporary camps become permanent houses, then towns, then cities. With dense settlements come new kinds of problems. Waste accumulates, human and animal. Water sources near villages become contaminated more easily. Pathogens that once burned through small bands and vanished now find steady fuel in large, tightly packed populations. Domesticated animals huddle nearby. Goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, chickens, dogs. They're warm-breathing islands of biology in constant contact with humans. Some microbes that once lived only in animals make the jump across species lines. Over centuries, and then millennia, what we now think of as classic crowd diseases either emerge or find their favourite host in us. Measles, smallpox, influenza, tuberculosis, some forms of plague. These illnesses do not require agriculture in a simple, direct way, but crowded, sedentary, animal-rich societies create perfect conditions for them to flourish. Hunter-gatherers died from infections too, of course. Wounds, parasites, acute diseases took their toll, but the epidemic cycles that sweep through large settled populations, killing many, sparing some, and then returning to find new generations of unexposed hosts, are closely tied to the post-Neolithic world. Given the dental decay, the stunted bones, the waves of disease, a question naturally arises in the dark. Why did anyone stick with farming? Why trade a flexible, diverse forager's diet and mobile lifestyle for fields, back-breaking labour, and all the new problems that came with them? There is no single answer, but several forces likely pulled in the same direction. One is simple arithmetic. Farming, once established, can support more people per unit of land than foraging. Even if individuals are less healthy, the total number of surviving children may be higher. A village of farmers can pack into a valley that would have sustained only a few scattered bands of hunter-gatherers. As farming populations grew, they could outnumber and eventually displace neighbouring foragers through sheer demographic weight. Another factor is climate. The end of the last ice age, around 11,700 years ago, brought relatively stable, warmer conditions to many regions. In some places, this stability made it easier for certain plants to thrive, and for humans to predict where resources would be. Later climate swings, like the Younger Dryas cold event, may have nudged people toward more intensive management of dependable plants when wild resources became unpredictable. There were social forces too. Stored grain is not just food, it is wealth. It can be given, traded, hoarded, stolen, taxed. Surpluses allow some people to specialize in tasks other than food production, toolmaking, ritual, warfare, administration. Hierarchies take root. Chiefs, priests, scribes, warriors emerge. Monumental architecture rises on fields of grain. For individuals caught inside these growing systems, leaving agriculture may not have been a real option. Once your landscape is cleared, your wild herds displaced, and your neighbours are all farmers, the old foraging ways become harder to sustain. So humanity doubled down. Over thousands of years, culture and biology began to respond to this new, grain-heavy reality.